To try to follow the lead of the moderator.
Madam, I
request
like you, really.
and change to just make a point. I'd like to talk about reparative justice as an instrument for economic growth within the context of SDG 8 and the role that reparative justice can play for connecting vulnerable populations to the economic opportunity to which they have been historically denied within their countries. Now I'll refer to my statement just for a second to add some context. When the legislative policy of a nation is layered with a historical systemic precedent that renders access to the benefits of economic growth institutionally prohibitive, the cost thereof is reparative justice. To restore people to the economic viability, it becomes necessary to construct strategic socioeconomic bridges of service and resource that connect those populations with the parity to which they have been denied. This is not about charity or individual culpability, but it is an acknowledgement of the need to empower and heal from generations of a national policy that may have been injurious to a particular people group. By way of example, I use the United States because that's where I live. I represent a population of 40 million people who make up the largest single minority group from whom we descended from the Turks, the Moors, the Spanish, the French, West Indian, Indigenous, African, several European and other nations, some of which have been documented to be in North America as early as the 15th century. Yet, as you know, we were enslaved in the 16th century and were simultaneously amalgamated by force into one group, now known as Negro, Black, African American, and for 245 more years thereafter worked for free to build the largest national economy in the world. For another 100 years, until just a half century ago, there were children denied access to the economy of their parents and that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents had built before them. Okay. And today, this is my final statement, and today have not yet inherited the return on their forebears' investment in that way that others have benefited. So your question was who is the question to? It is to any developed nation that has experienced similar disparities, and to this council and those going forward as we establish global precedent and policy that we consider reparative justice as a way to address these inequities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam.
Paper, and I'd like to inquire, because both are social stakeholder organizations. Are there representatives of governments who want to take the floor and feel a little bit disencouraged by me because I invited?
And then I go to Mr. Kono and to Mr. Nakisenovic. Start to learn it.
Right. Let me start with the issue related to libraries and culture and development. You may not find an indicator on libraries, but there are many related matters on culture and development in the SDG framework. And most recently, we have some good joint work with the UNESCO in particular on areas related to culture heritage, in rebuilding and reconstructing cities and places affected by either by natural shocks or by civil wars, as we have been doing with them in different countries in Africa and the Middle East. So you may not really see the kind of direct reference, but the principles are there reflected in the joint work. On the issues related to restorative justice or reparative justice, it's a very important question. And while we have been talking about investment in human capital in different ways, including the good references by the Honorable Minister, we see that the impact of the same kind of investment in education and health is not the same everywhere. Social mobility in countries like in the Nordic countries is faster than other OECD countries because of political economy constraints and because of history, as mentioned by the good speaker on reparative justice. So in few minutes, if you are not fully exhausted, we have a session at 1:15 today talking about inequality and why inequality and dealing with it is not just an economic problem, but primarily it's a political choice. And in addition to the investment that you like to have in human capital and infrastructure and digitalization, as we mentioned, and the investments related to climate and environment, there is some required changes in laws, specifically the discriminatory ones that are preventing people from having full access or not really treating the history as it should when it comes to some specific actions that needed to be addressed in particular locations or with particular people who had been disadvantaged for generations. And there are some good proposals for that, supported fully by great work by economists, not just at the World Bank Group, but Professor Chetty, for instance, had been really demonstrating to us in this country that you move a couple of miles away from a particular locality or municipality, and with the same kind of investment in human capital, you see different results because of this kind of intergenerational kind of disadvantage. So this is a very good point, but it has many solutions, but I'm afraid they are mainly political, not economic, because the resources is the same elsewhere. The other, yes, the more specific question related to the private sector, and if you are after a specific answer to Sierra Leone and what is happening there, including the most recent transaction that we have been doing with the private sector, our IFC office is open there, and we have just made a transaction a few days ago of $60 million. I just checked, thanks to technology, not because of good memory, on what we are doing most recently. But the issue, as I was trying to say at the beginning, is not about transactions, be them small or medium-sized, like 60 million. It's basically about the bigger picture. What are we doing better in partnership with Sierra Leone? And let's not be specific here because it may have some misunderstandings of any country. Are we going to be just doing the transactions, or we are fixing the, in partnership with the private sector and government, the investment climate? Or the doing business, for instance, which sometimes being loved or hated because it is ranking countries, but it is ranking countries based on their ability to make the business life for the local small and medium enterprises, not for the foreign direct investors. The big guys have their own ways to get access, at least through special laws and free zones. It's basically the small and medium enterprises that you need to open the field for them. And at the bank, we have an approach that is agreed upon based on the Hamburg principles and the maximization of finance for development, that we need first to establish the rules of the game in terms of governance, rule of law, fighting corruption, enhancing the investment climate. And meanwhile, we are doing investments at risk supported by MIGA, for instance, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, if it is a foreign direct investor, and in partnership with the small and medium enterprises, and as much as we can, we prevent governments from crowding out the private sector. So officially, with all due respect, if the government of Sierra Leone wants to have an establishment of a new terminal for the airport there, we will say, no, we will not fund your airport terminal. But we can work, as we did with other countries, in a consortium with the private sector based on PPP rules to facilitate this kind of entry in infrastructure and make the concessional finance, the dear kind of money, to be allocated for other lines of business where the private sector cannot do, like in education, health, basic infrastructure.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
is that adequate? Well, I'm happy to follow up on that particular question with more examples, more country specific. But yes, this is what we are trying to do. But it requires more than the World Bank Group to do it. And that's why we are saying leveraging and private with the private sector in the field where we can.
But my suggestion to you, sir, and maybe to all